Hi, everyone. We are glad that you're here. I'm Tracy Platts, the Executive Director of the Eisenhower Institute, and on behalf of my staff and the college, we welcome you to making meaningful connections in a post-COVID world, something that I think we are all trying to navigate at this point. I am very excited to introduce you to our annual Scharf Lecture for today, and she's going to give us some wisdom, and then we're going to have a conversation that we hope to draw you into as well. Our guest today is Sally Susman, as you know, because you are here. Sally is Executive Vice President and Chief Corporate Affairs Officer at Pfizer. She is also Vice Chair of the Pfizer Foundation and Co-Chair of Pfizer's Political Action Committee. She leads engagement with all of Pfizer's external stakeholders. So she oversees communications, corporate responsibility, global policy, government relations, investor relations, and patient advocacy. We all now know Pfizer very well because we are all probably at some point, or at least many of us, Pfizer patients, given the what's happened over the last 3 years with the vaccine. So Sally, before joining Pfizer in 2007, held several senior communications and government relations positions at a number of different institutions. She has worked in the corporate world. She spent 8 years in government, focused on international trade issues. In 2002, Forbes named Sally one of the world's most influential CMOs for Pfizer's efforts to combat vaccine misinformation. And as a former journalist, that is something that is near and dear to my heart, combating misinformation, particularly when it comes to health issues. She is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And so I welcome and I ask you to welcome with me at this time, Sally Susman. Hi there. Sorry, I'm going to try to work around this tree a little bit so that I can see you well. I do have just a few brief prepared remarks because I'm really eager to get to Tracy's questions. You know, as a former journalist, I'm sure she's going to be very tough on me this afternoon. I also want to thank you for coming today. I know I'm competing with a very beautiful day outside and probably some, other fun things you can be doing. So it means a lot to me that you came, and I hope you find this interesting and provocative. I also want to thank the Eisenhower Institute and Gettysburg College for inviting me here today. The Eisenhower Institute mission really spoke to me, putting young people together with senior public policy officials to incite passion and solve big problems. That's really important work. So thank you for that. I also understand that it's through the generosity of Dr. William Sunderman who established this lecture series. I looked him up and I found out that he was a scientist, an educator, a musician, a doctor, a philanthropist, and net, I would have really liked to know him.
So he seemed like a very cool guy. I also have to recognize my friend Bill Heyman, who's sitting down there. Bill is an alumni of this college, a trustee of this college, and believe me, there isn't a person in New York City that doesn't hear about this college from Bill. So thank you, Bill, for making this connection for me and for coming with me today, for being my friend. And lastly, I'm just really grateful to Tracy Potts. We had an introductory phone call, and you had me at hello. Your energy, your commitment, and thank you for making this work. I really appreciate it. Okay, so let's travel back together 3 years to the beginning of the pandemic. My boss, who's the CEO of Pfizer, said we had to do 3 things. 1, take care of our 85,000 employees. 2, make sure the steady stream of medicine would continue to flow through the world because cancer didn't go on holiday during the pandemic. All kinds of terrible illnesses didn't stop. And if you remember, the supply chain wasn't so great. You know, you couldn't get a car, you couldn't get a refrigerator, but you could get your medicine. So I'm very proud of that. And then my boss said, and we're going to make a vaccine for the world by the end of the year. And I thought, oh no, I'm in the middle of a pandemic and my boss has lost his mind. Because it takes usually 12 years to make a vaccine, not 8 months. So I was like, uh-oh, he's gone, you know. And then the next thing he did was shocking to me. And I worked in 3 companies for 9 CEOs, and I had never seen this move before. Albert had to, that's my boss, Albert, had to assign a project manager to lead the vaccine work. And I knew this would be a tough job, many long hours, a lot of stress, and he assigned himself as the project manager. And that's when I first thought, oh, maybe we are going to do this. So he had this bold intention, and it was one of the most incredible times in my life, and we'll talk a little bit about it. A friend of mine in New York, who was a first responder at 9/11, said, the only thing harder than being at the center of a crisis is to be on the sidelines of the crisis. And I knew what he meant, that, you know, at least I had a chance to make a difference, and it was a lot of pressure, but it was very meaningful because we were in a tough time as society to think maybe I could turn that pressure into something positive. And one of my idols, the social activist and tennis player Billie Jean King, she says, pressure is a privilege. And I agree with that and consider it a great privilege to have been working on this project. So during the busiest time of my career, I had a lot going on. I also wrote the book Breaking Through. And you are going to be given copies, is that right, Tracy? People will be free to take a copy of the book. It has 10 principles that I have been thinking about for almost 40 years in government and business, but they crystallized during the pandemic, and the book was written during that time. It's been released just 2 weeks ago, so I'm really happy to be here to share it with you. Of these 10 principles, I'm just going to touch on 3 quickly, because as I said, I'm eager to get to the conversation. But the first principle I'd like to talk about is being very intentional in our communications. You know, what is it we're trying to say? Does anybody here do yoga? Nobody? Okay, Bill. But if you take a yoga class, the first thing the teacher will do is ask you to set an intention for the class. And it can be that, you know, you wish for a good thing for a loved one, or you hope for an answer to a question that's been plaguing you. I decided that during the pandemic, in my work rolling out the vaccine, I also needed to set an intention. So my intention was that while the company was going through a scientific transformation, I was going to try to take us through a trust and reputation transformation at the same time. Because I think you know that a lot of big pharma companies don't have good reputations. This is why I went to Pfizer in the first place. I worked in some great companies, American Express, Estee Lauder. These are companies everybody loves. And then I was going to a company that made life-saving medicine that really nobody. And so I worked on that for over 10 years. And it wasn't until the pandemic gave me my chance to really show our purpose, to be more transparent, to make ourselves more available, to not be defensive, that we were able to change the reputation of our company. And now, Pfizer is a top 4 global brand around the world, according to Fortune magazine. So we no longer have that low reputation, we have a high reputation. So principle number 1 is all about being intentional. And even before I started talking to you today, I took a little walk. Your campus is beautiful. And I set an intention, that I hoped in my talk that I would give you food for thought, maybe a little inspiration, and hopefully some humor too. So that's the first one. The second principle is about, if something's really important to you, to have the courage to be candid. And here I want to tell a very personal story, not so much a professional story, but when I was just graduating from college in the early 1980s, I realized that I'm gay. And it was not like now, where there's much more acceptance for being gay. This was in the early 1980s, when we were in the middle of an AIDS epidemic, when most gay people were living their life in the closet, and I knew I didn't want that. So I also knew that in order to have an authentic life, I would need to go home to St. Louis, Missouri, where I grew up, and tell my parents. And I knew it was going to be bad. It was only a question of how bad would it be. So I told them I was coming. We had dinner. We sat down in the den after dinner, and I did my best to communicate this in a non-defensive way. I told them I loved them, that I wanted to be close to them, and that I'm gay. And my mom was mad. My dad started to cry. This is the man I admire most in the world. And he said to me, "You'll never have a spouse, you'll never have children, you'll never have a career." And those words, they cut me deep. He wasn't trying to hurt me, but this was his parental fear talking. It was the reality that he believed. And in that painful moment, my life plan was formed. I knew if I only had 3 things, those would be the 3 things. And so my wife Robin and I have been together for 35 years. We have a daughter, accomplished and bold and brave, who's 29. And I'm really proud of the work that I do at Pfizer. So the reason I'm telling you this story, may not be the regular Eisenhower Institute story, but that is because I believe so powerfully in candor, and that you may suffer a short-term loss or pain, or even a mid-term loss or pain, but you will have a long-term gain in pride and peace and truly authentic relationships. So I want to make a little call to action to each of you. If there's something stuck in your throat that you need to say to somebody, say it. If there's a draft in your outbox of an email that maybe you think is not going to land well or not be the right time, send it, because it's extremely important. And now the third example, before we start to chat, really is my final principle in my book, is about seeking harmony. And I try to answer the question about why is everybody so angry today? Why are we so polarized? And I read a recent, something called the Edelman Trust Barometer, and they said that only 30% of people in our country would help someone who was hurt if they thought they disagreed with them. Which means 70% of people would just walk on by if someone was on the ground hurt, if they said, well, they're not like me or they don't think like me. And this really upset me, and I try to think about, what is it we can really strive for here? And I don't know if any of you have heard of Adam Grant. He's a very popular workplace guru and thinker on leadership and organizational issues. And he says, quote, "Harmony is the pleasing arrangement of different tones, voices, or instruments, not the combination of identical sounds." And I really latched onto that because the truth is we're not going to all agree. We're going to have different opinions. And that's okay. You know, you don't have to win every argument. You don't have to score every point when you're talking to someone. What we need to do is to find a way to live together civilly, to disagree agreeably, and to be able to move forward as a society. I think some of that is rooted in the Eisenhower Institute work. And so in conclusion, I really hope you'll take my book and read it, and that it will give you strategies and practical ideas for how to have your own breakthroughs. The title is Breakthroughs that, what is the title? Breaking Through, Communicating to Open Minds, Move Hearts, and Change the World. And I want you to have all that wisdom. So thank you very much for listening. And Tracy? Thank you.
Sally, I have been so excited to have this conversation with you.
Me too.
I really have, because not often do we see someone come out of the corporate world and literally break through in such an authentic way. And you use this word authenticity. For me, I think that has just been a gradual thing that has now become a foundation of my life. If you can't be authentic about what you do and how you do it every day, then why are you doing it? I wanted to talk to you, so I wanted to go back a little bit. You've had so many great experiences. You have worked at the highest levels of corporate America. You have worked at the highest levels of government, which I saw when I met you in Washington the other day. And
That was fun.
That was really fun,
Yeah.
and many of your friends were there. Even going back before that, you have worked in community. What have you found is different, and what's the same about those different areas in which you found yourself?
Sure. And again, thank you so much, Tracy, for inviting me. And you opened on authenticity. So can I say a word on authenticity, then I'll answer your question? I think authenticity is this really overused word. You know, everyone says, we need to be authentic, we need to be authentic. And I used it probably too many times in my talk. Being authentic is this weird journey to yourself. And it seems like, how hard could it be to be yourself? But it's actually really hard. And that is why I spend so much time thinking about it and why it's so important. And people who do know themselves really deeply are the people that can articulate visions and can bring people along because they're relatable. You know, like as we've been talking and I'm getting to know you and you're getting to know me, we have a much different kind of connection. So authenticity has really power.
Can I tell you, so I met Sally, so you made reference to the time that we first met virtually last fall,
Yeah.
when we started talking about this event. But I met her in person for the first time at an event for her book last week. And you really lived out your book. So I walk into this home that I had never been in, and one of the first people I see is Sally, and she goes, Tracy! And she like walks up to me and gives me a hug. And I'm like, who is this person? Like, people don't do that in DC at parties anymore.
Well, I'm from New York, you know.
Oh, yeah, fair enough. But I think you're right, this whole journey to yourself.
Yeah.
But I think it's part that, and then it's part, once you realize that, having the courage to display it in the many different places where we are, right?
And
Me being the same Tracy at an event in Georgetown, at an event here in Gettysburg with my family, in my church, and that is a journey.
Yes, it's a crazy thing, but it is a journey to find yourself. So your question about, you know, having worked in government and a couple of different companies is, when I was a kid, I wanted to do good in the world. I think most kids do. I thought maybe I'd be the mayor of my hometown in St. Louis, or I thought I might be a journalist, which, as I said, is a very noble profession. I ended up on Capitol Hill after I graduated from college, working in the mailroom, and I spent 6 years, various positions there. I then later worked for President Clinton, and I actually decided that government's not the only place that you can do good. In fact, sometimes government can be a bit slow.
No.
It can be a little bit bureaucratic. And I had an idea that became a theory of mine, which is that I thought I could do a lot of good from very big public-facing companies, companies that have interest in what's happening in the world, that are leadership companies that need to be forward-facing. And I have found that and really felt that. And I know a lot of people, a lot of young people are sometimes anti-big business or don't want to spend their life in a corporation. And I understand that and I respect it. But I would also ask, don't write it off. There's some great jobs in companies that are doing a lot of meaningful work. And I really enjoy being in the business.
I will tell you, it's interesting that you say that, because as a journalist, some of the greatest stories I ever did were with foundations of large companies. And it's the heart oftentimes of corporate America. Where you really get a chance to show those things that you care about.
Yeah, and that's part of my group, the foundation.
That sounds cool. That sounds like fun work. So one of the things that you talk about in the book, one of the bedrock concepts, is this idea that being a good communicator is not, as we so often hear, a soft skill. So kind of walk us through your thinking about that and why communication really should no longer be considered a soft skill, which I think is so important for this group of students who are about to walk out into the world and need to understand the importance of that.
So you've gone right to the core of my argument in the book, which is that you're making a foolish mistake if you write off communications as a soft skill. And if you're even contemplating a career in business, you might think, well, I have to know my accounting, I have to know my finance, I have to know my management theory, I have to know how to do inventory. But my argument is that if you want to be a leader who really makes change and really breaks through, you'll recognize that communications is a rock-hard competency, that it is essential to your success, that you have to focus on it, you have to practice it, you have to be disciplined at it. You know, it's not just something that happens. And I've seen so many great leaders like senators and cabinet secretaries and CEOs make the mistake of not preparing, not pausing, not using some of the techniques I like humor or reflection, failing to pause at the appropriate times. And in doing so, they just undermine their own messaging. And they're not as effective as they can be. And I've tried to make these 10 principles simple, but like standing on one leg in yoga, it's not that simple, but it gets better with practice.
Do you feel that you were always a good communicator? How did that develop for you?
I'm very fortunate. I have really great parents, and they drilled some stuff into me early that I appreciated. So my parents were interested in politics, and we used to have people come to the house, and they were always about making the eye contact, shaking the hand, speaking up, writing the thank you notes, some very basics. They also required my brother and me every night to come to the dinner table with a news fact, okay? Not weather, not sports, but like a breaking news fact, to repeat it and explain it and say why it was significant. My brother and I thought this was cruel and unusual punishment. And why couldn't we just chow down like the other families in our neighborhood? But I'm actually really grateful for that habit because, you know, I do spend a lot of time taking in the news. I try to think about it. What does it mean to me? What does it mean to my company? So it's always been in me, but having the opportunity to work in this space, which is such a dynamic space because of social digital channels, because of a stakeholder mindset out there, people really wanting to advocate for themselves. And all of my ideas, they crystallized in the trauma of the pandemic because I had to put them to the test.
You talked about pausing, and you talk about that in your book as well. In my work as a journalist, I often noticed that when I was interviewing people, some of the best thoughts, some of the most poignant thoughts came when I didn't force people to keep talking or force myself to keep talking, when I gave the conversation a little room to breathe. Talk a little bit about that dynamic and why it's important.
Yes, I'm a big about the pause, okay, because I make a lot of mistakes, and I realize I make most of my mistakes when I'm rushing. Just running. And I made a big one once when I was with the Estee Lauder companies. I was head of communications, And my job was to call up journalists like you and pitch them on our people, our products, our celebrities. And one day some journalists called me, which was rare. And they started just asking me a lot of nice questions, like, how did you get to be so successful?
I'm already shaking because I feel like I know where this is going.
You know where it's going. How have you been so successful? Really buttering me up. And I didn't stop for a second. I didn't do any of the due diligence I would have done if this reporter had called about anybody else in the company. I let my ego weigh in. And then they finally said to me, well, we heard you were giving a big speech and that you were struck down in the middle of the speech because you got a toe cramp from your pointy, fancy shoes. And that was a true story. And the minute they asked me that, I felt like a polar bear who fell through the ice. Realized I made a terrible mistake. The next day, on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, was a story about executive women wearing pointy shoes and how they were getting toe cramps and they were having foot surgery. And I was so embarrassed, right? This is what I do for a living, and I screwed up. And it was because I just didn't take the time to reflect. I learned a lot that day, including I only wear nice soft round shoes like this.
You're wearing very sensible
No, I wear all
shoes.
now. I moved to sensible shoes after this story. It just was a great lesson for me in the power of pausing. And it's funny what you say about what a lot of journalists do when they're interviewing you is they'll ask a question, I'll answer the question, and then there's silence. And sometimes it's nice to have the time to expand and let the conversation breathe, but sometimes it makes you very uncomfortable, and so you just keep talking. And that's when, again, you make mistakes.
They know that, by the way.
The journalists know that.
They definitely
know that. So I try to just say, slow it down, pause.
Interesting. So I thought about this when you were talking. How do you bounce back effectively from mistakes and big mistakes? I mean, we all have situations where I've been here for a year and a half, and I've certainly had oops moments here and prior to that. How do you, with authenticity in mind, how do you bounce back from having made a big mistake? Because our first reaction, I think our human reaction is to go, I'm not going to acknowledge that.
Yes, but that's not a good plan. I share in the book a lot of mistakes, and I made some big whoppers, and I even shared the embarrassing ones. And one of the first ones was in that first job I mentioned on Capitol Hill when I just graduated from college, and I was working in the mailroom, and I overheard the senator talking to one of his senior aides about his intention to announce in the next coming weeks his retirement. Well, I was young, I was naive, I had this big piece of gossip, and I told someone. Who told someone? Who told someone? And the next thing you know, the media is knocking on the door of the office, they're calling the senator, and his whole plans were blown. He lost control of the story, he didn't have the timetable, and the source of the leak was pretty quickly traced back to me. And so I had to go into the senator, I was sweating, I'm pretty much gonna sweat now when I think about this story, and I had to apologize to him, which I did. And I made a sincere apology, but it was never the same between us in that office. And it was a huge mistake, but I learned the most valuable thing. I am now a citadel of confidence. If you, Tracy, say to me, I'm gonna tell you something, Sally, but I need you not to tell anyone, I will never. And being in the work that I do, it's really important to be able to keep a confidence, I know a lot of material information, I know a lot of confidential information, and I've never made that mistake since. So I think if you can process your mistakes openly and share them, they become less shameful, less painful, and real opportunities just to be better.
It's almost, I know I've experienced, it's almost like the moment that you say, I did that and I messed up and I'm sorry. It's almost like a weight comes off of you because it needs to happen. I love that you sit here as this highly accomplished woman, acknowledging that it hasn't always been perfect for you. And I think particularly as I'm going backwards here when I was in your place, right? When I was a college student about to embark on the world, and it can be intimidating, and you're thinking, oh, I have to do everything right. I'm going into a corporate world. I'm learning a whole new community, and we're not always going to do it right, but it's okay because you learn through that process, and you could end up being a Sally Susman sitting here. You did really well for yourself professionally, and I think through your book you grew personally as well. But you worked through.
Yeah, and everybody does. And
Yeah.
I had no idea what I was going to do when I graduated from college. And I didn't have a 5-year plan, and I don't have a 5-year plan. But I had passions. I had a passion for politics. I had a passion for reading and writing. And I was very fortunate to find a career that lets me play in those passionate spaces.
One of the things you talk about in your book also is humility. I really wanted to talk about that because I think it dovetails very much with this world that we live in that is very polarized. You talk about harmony as well, and I think those things go hand in hand. Why is that so important, and how can we better exercise humility?
Well, humility, like authenticity, creates a relatable person because we all have insecurities, we all have anxieties, we all are uncertain about things, and letting people know that right up front gives you a much better chance to connect with them. And if you do the opposite and you're showing everybody how much better you are than them and how much smarter you are than them, it's, as you know, it's not much of a formula for success anywhere. And I'm in your question, I'm remembering that during the pandemic, all the biopharmaceutical companies actually worked together. It was very unusual because we were very competitive. And yet it was such an extraordinary time that we laid down our competitive spirits and we worked together. And one of the things we did in the heat of it, when there was a lot of politics around the virus, around the vaccine, we all got together and took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, in Washington Post, in USA Today, and we said that we were going to abide by the rules, we weren't going to rush our clinical trials, we weren't going to put any information forward before it was fully mature, and we were going to all play by the rules, no politics. And then 7 CEOs signed it from the 7 vaccine-making companies. So then, several months later, I'm on a Zoom meeting, and there's a guy from another company saying that whole thing was his idea, their idea, and I knew it was our idea, my idea. And I was mad, and the hair's up on the back of my neck, and I'm like ready to take him down. I have the facts on my side. And I just had this aha that it was actually okay for him to believe that he did it, for me to not have credit for it, and that we would have a better long-term outcome, he and I, if I could let that pass. And I did let it pass. And he and I do have a good relationship, and that was very important to not need to claim the credit.
Wow. That's quite a lesson learned.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, really interesting lesson learned. Well, I'm imagining that our audience, hopefully inspired as I am, may have some questions or some thoughts. If so, I will open at this time for you all to jump into the conversation. Yes.
Hello, my name is Anthony York, poli-sci, math and econ major. I just wanted to ask about the value of communication, because obviously when we have a pandemic, when there's a lot of misinformation going around and so many people are potential customers of this product, there's a lot of value in getting the right information out there. But in less, chaotic times when apathy and not caring are really the major things in your way, is the value of does that change the value of communication? Is it better just to do your thing and have the product be as good as possible, and then the people who need it will find it? Or is there still a lot of value in that public communication?
That's a really great question. Thanks so much for asking it. And you're right. I mean, the pandemic was a rare set of circumstances. We were leading the news every day. Our scientists were on TV, and I had to remind them to comb their hair because they're scientists. And, it was an extraordinary time. But I do believe it is as important in regular times, but maybe it's harder because of the apathy that you're talking about. We had the attention of the world, and now we don't. And so I have to work harder to get people open their minds and move their hearts and get them thinking about things. Like for now, what we're taking on is cancer. We shifted, we still have our COVID medicine, but we really shifted in and trying to say we've got to go full bore at cancer. 1 in 3 people will have a cancer diagnosis in their lifetime in this country. And so you have to find the statistics or the facts like that make something relevant for people. And I also feel that one of the things I learned in the pandemic is that we now are facing a pandemic of misinformation and disinformation. And misinformation, I understand. If somebody doesn't understand something, I will take all the time in the world to explain it to them. And, a lot of people were hesitant to take the vaccine, and I understand. They didn't know about mRNA technology. The vaccine had come together very quickly. We were all scared anyway. And I spent a lot of time answering questions, listening to people, and really just trying to help them become more confident. But there's also disinformation, which is something very different, which is purposeful, deceitful, things that people do to build their own crowds and followers, to fundraise. And I'm like going after that too, because I do feel it's really important that we continue to have a public conversation on things that matter. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. We have another one over here.
Right, the students.
As we were talking, it reminded me, we can come back to this later, about the relationship between communication and trust. And we accept communication from people we trust, but communication can also build trust.
Yeah, can I throw a thought in there?
Yeah,
So we're getting to you right away. I thought that the way to get people to take the vaccine would be to build trust through data and experts. Okay, so we had a ton of data, clinical trial data, all kinds of facts and figures and analytics, and all the scientists, politicians, rock stars, they wanted to help. But it wasn't what made the difference. What made the difference was 2 things that surprised me. 1, old-fashioned storytelling. So, like, if you could say, well, I got to see my grandkids for the first time in 2 years because I'm vaccinated. Or if people could say, I got to get back on the college campus because I was vaccinated, which certainly must have impacted some of you. And it wasn't the celebrities, it was the teacher, the preacher, the neighbor, the daughter, the
barbershop
son, the barber, right? Yeah, definitely. So that was
all those campaigns in the barbershop, right? In the beauty shop.
That's who people trusted.
Yeah, interesting.
So you've had first off, thank you very much for coming and being able to talk to us. You've had a long, successful career kind of bridging corporate America and the American government, American politics. And myself, and I'm sure many other people in this room, is interested in a career like that. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about, for that sort of path, do you think it's better to start out on the corporate side or start out on the government side and then kind of go across? Do we get a Hill internship or a credit internship if we could, or at a big company? So if you could talk a little bit about that kind of dichotomy, and in the current situation, which one you would recommend starting out as?
Great question. Well, personally, I started in government. And those internships are hard to get, I know. And yet, as I reflect on it, I don't know that you have to take it in that kind of order. And what might be more important is it an environment where somebody's going to take an interest in you thriving and growing and exposing you? Because you could have a fabulous Hill internship or you could have a lousy Hill internship. And so what's really hard, but I think very important in any company you pick or government office, is to try to get in there and meet the people. And I like to say, can you hear the music in the background? And, Bill Heyman is a fantastic, he has a huge career in search and recruiting. And I don't know if you'll back me up on this or not, but what I mean by hear the music, I don't literally mean hear the music. I mean, does it feel like a place where you're going to thrive? That to me is the most important thing. And it's why I went from a financial company to a beauty company to a pharmaceutical company. It was less about what do they make and more about, are they interested? Are they fun? Are they interested in knowing me? Do I get a sense that it's going to be good for me here? And I would put that as the highest thing as you're talking to people.
It's almost like choosing a college, right? I hear this oftentimes when I talk to people about why they chose our college is once I visited, I felt the culture. It felt like the right place for me to be. It felt like the right place for me to grow. What a great question, because I think as you move into the workforce and the corporate world, it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, is this a right fit for me to grow? Which goes back to your earlier point about being intentional.
Mm-hmm.
We may not always know where that path is going to lead, but if we have some sense of, I want to, become a better communicator, for example. Is this going to be a place, whether it's the government, whether it's a big corporation, whether it's a mom and pop business, that's going to allow me to move in that direction?
Exactly.
Yeah. I know there must be other questions out there. Because I'm a journalist, right? I have 15,000 questions, but Tom has one.
I made the mistake of sitting in the front row and I knew I had to leave early. So I figured I'd trade a question for
No worries. Thanks for coming.
No, of course. As someone who is interested in health policy, I was wondering if you could just talk more generally about what it's been like to work in the health policy field just generally.
It's the best field because there's so much purpose to it. When I used to work at Estee Lauder, if we had a bad day, I'd say, well, nobody died. If you have a bad day in a medicine company, people will die. And the Journal of American Medical Journal, sorry, what's JAMA?
Journal of American Medical Association.
Thank you.
Yeah.
They have calculated that over 1 million lives were saved in this country because of the vaccine, and many millions of lives when you take the whole country. So I love the purposefulness of it. I love the challenge of it. It's really difficult. And maybe your question is making me think of another important answer to your question, which is, if you have a choice between an easier job and a harder job, take the harder job. And healthcare policy may be the hardest job out there right now because this country has a big problem. People cannot afford their healthcare. And what's happened is a lot of finger pointing. The insurance companies point at the pharma companies point at the benefit managers point at the doctors and the hospitals. And as a country, and this goes to my feelings of harmony, we might not all exactly agree, but we have to find a way to work through this problem. We tried before several times as a country. We had the Affordable Care Act under President Obama, which made some steps, but not enough steps. And we can't live in a country with these set of problems. And I hope as many people as possible will go into healthcare policy because it's fascinating and it's really important. And if you need to go, don't worry. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
That's very helpful.
Can we go back to that point about the easy job versus the hard job?
Yeah.
Have you ever, I think I made that jump. I think it was 1.5 years ago when I came here. And I'm loving it, honestly, because I get to do things like this. But talk a little bit about that, particularly, again, for folks who are about to enter the workforce. That takes intention, and it also takes some courage. Have you ever been in a situation where you jumped into a professional situation, you took a job, and you're like, I don't know if I can do this?
When I went to Pfizer, when I left Estee Lauder, I had a great job. I got to go to lunch with the beauty editors. First of all, I got to go to lunch, which I haven't been to lunch since I started at Pfizer. We did have lunch with you, I know I did. But, and, you know, some of my boss's wife, when I told her I was going to Pfizer, she cried. And she's like, oh, it's horrible there, big pharma. My friends didn't want me to go. And the first few years were really traumatic for me. I didn't think I would survive or make it. I would go home at night and my wife would say, just quit, it's not that important, you know. And I don't know, I stuck it out because I'm afraid to fail and I have bills to pay. And yet I'm so grateful that I did. If I hadn't stayed, I wouldn't have had this opportunity in the pandemic. I wouldn't have my book. I wouldn't have my wonderful colleagues. But the first few years were really, really hard and stressful. And it was a much tougher task to try to engage in this health policy debate than to promote an already loved product.
Can you talk about, you mentioned when you were speaking at the beginning about starting something challenging in the middle of an already turbulent and challenging time. So in your case, we were in the middle of a pandemic and you said, you know what, I'm gonna undertake this really difficult thing of restoring trust in the healthcare industry.
Why not?
Why not right now in the middle of a pandemic? That takes some courage, but what was your plan?
I had no plan. My plan was, okay, so we're having this horrible pandemic. Pfizer's trying to make a vaccine. And I decide I'm going to embed media in the company while we're doing this. So I picked the Wall Street Journal, had 2 reporters that were going around with us, and the Nat Geo documentary channel put a film crew in with us. Because I thought, if we are successful, this is going to be a story I want to tell for the rest of my life, as do the 85,000 people who work at Pfizer and feel so proud. And then I thought, but what if I fail?
But I was going to say, isn't there a risk there though?
There was an enormous risk.
Journalists and cameras swarming in place.
Well, we had to keep the factories clean and aseptic. We had to keep the labs rolling. The last thing I wanted was for Sally's camera crew to cause a problem. We were social distancing. So we had to go through a lot of precautions. But then I was terrified, Tracy, about the risk. And I had sleepless nights where I thought, I'm wasting people's time during the pandemic because they all were being interviewed, that I might be filming the greatest failure in corporate history. Pfizer put $2 billion into this thing before we knew if it worked. And then the day on the Sunday, when we found out that it did, we were waiting to find out, and we were in the conference room waiting for the call from the FDA, and the camera's rolling. And I thought, oh my gosh. And then we found out it was 95% effective. Our chief scientist said, this is the greatest medical advance in human history. And so, of course, I was gratified, but if it had gone wrong, I realized I'd have much bigger problems than a bad news day for Pfizer. If we had been wrong, we might not be sitting here together today. So, I had to keep it in perspective.
This is so interesting that you describe it that way as you sit in front of the Eisenhower Institute sign, because it reminds me of President Eisenhower and D-Day and his approach, which was, look, I'm going to own this.
Yeah.
I'm planning this. If it goes well, or if it doesn't go well, it was my choice.
Yeah.
It's going down.
And doing this, putting the media inside Pfizer when we're having this crazy time, was my idea. I owned it. I'm very proud of it. And the next day, so we find out the vaccine works on a Sunday. Monday, there are pages and pages in the Wall Street Journal. They've got the whole story. It was beautiful. I was so thankful. And they had a funny headline. The headline was, Pfizer vaccine, crazy deadlines and a pushy CEO. And it's true. And we laugh about that, Albert and I, to this day, because it wasn't that we said we'd do it in 10 years instead of 12. We said we'd do it in 8 months instead of 12, which required us to really go out of the box. And as I said, he was the project manager. He was the guy prodding us forward. And so they really got it.
Wow.
And the movie is on YouTube. If you want to watch it, it's called Mission Possible. And if you type in Mission Possible, it's 46 minutes. And whenever I have a bad day, I watch that movie for 46 minutes. It's fantastic.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I know there may be some other questions. Yes.
So my name's Karen. Thank you for coming out here today. You mentioned the story about inviting camera crews into the business to basically be transparent, as well as your boss taking personal lead in project management. To be so open and communicative, right? Setting a clear objective, being individually responsible for it, all requires a significant degree of confidence and success, or at least in oneself to manage sometimes inevitable failure. From where do you derive that confidence, or from where do successful leaders derive that confidence?
That is a really insightful question. And in the 9 CEOs I worked for, the senators and the cabinet secretaries, the worst thing a leader can be is insecure. It is really a problem. And that's not to say they should be arrogant or not listen to other people, but insecurity is crippling in a leader. And so they all draw their confidence from different places. I mean, I drew a lot of my confidence from working from a CEO who was also himself very confident. Why is he so confident? First of all, he's Jewish and he's Greek, and his parents narrowly survived the Holocaust. His parents this close to not making it. And so I think that infused him with a certain amount of optimism and tenacity and vision. And that he loves everything Greek, and he's always quoting Greek philosophers, and his favorite is a quote from Aristotle that says, the problem is not to aim high and miss. The problem is to aim low and hit. And I just never forgot that, because that's what so many people do. They make a low goal. They're going to go for the first job they're offered, or they're going to take the easy class. And that's just not going to make the difference. And so having the confidence and finding whatever source it comes from for you, something in your experience, something in your family, and then this idea that setting your sights really high is so inspiring to the people around you.
You talked about this really challenging and disappointing conversation that you had with your parents. I wonder if, and how that really helped you set your intentions. I'm wondering, as you address that question, if that led to some of your confidence.
You just might be right about that. I didn't think about that, but when you're willing to sort of put it all on the line, and you survive it, you not only survive, but you thrive. I definitely think that is a related point.
And I love how, after relating that story, again, really being evidence of what you've written in your book about humility and about kindness. You later talked about your family and about what great parents they were. And you talked about, you were able to sort of separate, not make that moment the entire relationship, but really talk about how they poured into you and your brother. And even though at the time you didn't say it that way, but you were able to see, we don't nuance very well.
Nuance is really important. And I feel I need to complete the story about my parents and to say they're now my biggest fans. Okay. My dad, if you have like 5 minutes or maybe 5 hours, he would like to tell you how great I am. He's like my publicist. My mom bought 100 copies of the book, and she gives them out to all of her friends, even though this story is in the book. I mean, we've been through something, but it made us a lot stronger together.
Yeah, and families and relationships and life is like that. It's important to people.
And nuance, and that's, I know there's words around this like intersectionality and stuff, but the point is that we are all many things, and you have to be willing to be nuanced about that. I am a woman, I'm a mother, I'm a leader, I'm a writer, I'm gay. Like it's a nuanced collage, and every one of us is all those things.
There was a question in the back, looks like too.
In management, we talk about situational style leadership. And we also say that when you work on deadlines, the leader has to be authoritative, or he or she is expected to follow authority. So you were when we were developing the vaccine, what sort of leadership style was followed, and then how do you, what's the role of the leader in coming out of in developing this vaccine?
That's a great question, and I really feel that Pfizer would not have had a vaccine if Albert Bourla had not been our leader. I've worked for other leaders who might have decided to lay low. Let's husband our cash because we don't know what's going to happen. And so his style was right for that set of circumstances. And as you say, really tough circumstances do require more authoritarian style. And nobody likes authoritarian styles these days. It's a lot of peace and kumbaya. But we needed somebody to say, this is what we're doing. And so we met 3 times a week as a team. And usually in a company, the CEO meets with his direct reports, who then meet with their direct reports, and then everybody meets down. And somewhere along the way, the message gets lost, and then people disagree, or they have politics, or they have turf. So on these calls 3 times a week, everybody was on the call. So you might have the floor manager of the manufacturing plant in Michigan where we made the vaccine on the call, because we didn't have time for this chain of communication to work. Albert wanted to know, how many can you make? How fast? And in the history of Pfizer, and in our best years, we made 200 million vaccines. The guy says, I think I can make 500 million. And Albert says, no, 3 billion. Okay. And, and then they would come back with a new plan that would be a lot closer to 3 billion. Clinical trial, big piece of any new drug. You have to get people into clinical trials. It can take years. So the team's very proud. They say, we think we could do it in 3 months instead of 3 years. He said, you have 3 weeks for this clinical trial. And he would be tough on us. He would often circle back after the call and say, oh, I know, Tracy, I was really hard on you. Are you okay? So it's a combination of sort of this toughness coupled with a lot of caring, but it was the only way it was going to happen.
I'm learning as well. Leadership is a journey. And you talk about that authoritarian style, and one of the things that I'm learning on this journey is, as I see my whole staff staring at me back here, is that there are times, as you say, when you need somebody to call it, right? You need someone to say, whether people like it, whether they think they can do it, whether they're not, we need a leader. We need you to lead. We need you to make a decision on this so that we can follow you. And knowing, as you talked about, when to implement that style versus when to implement, and when you have time to implement a more collaborative style, not in the middle of a pandemic, is part of that journey.
Absolutely.
We have just a few minutes left, and I have a question that I would love to end this on, which is, you talk in your book about humor. I told someone when I met you, I said, she's funny, but not like the belly laughing funny thing. It's like you're talking with Sally and all of a sudden you realize, oh, that was funny. That type of thing, a comfortable funny. So talk to me about the really important role of humor in all
I
this.
will. And I think I may have told you that of the 10 principles, the 10 chapters of the book, humor was the hardest one to write. And I almost dropped it a bunch of times because I thought, I can't get this right. I'm worried about a politically correct environment. I'm worried I'm going to get cancel cultured. People are afraid. They're afraid to make a joke. And the good news is I can't tell a joke to save my life. So I'm not talking about that kind of bada bing, bada boom, slapstick humor. And certainly in professional settings, nobody's going to be dancing on the tables with lampshades on their head. But what I am talking about is a lightness of being able to really value happiness. And when Pfizer has 4 corporate values: courage, excellence, equity, and joy. And I challenge you to send me an email with another Fortune 50 company that has joy in their corporate values. But when we came up with joy, we said, okay, well, what do we mean? You can't just say something like that. So we thought about it, and they were ideas such as, we take our jobs really seriously, but not ourselves. That laughter is good medicine too. This is a pretty wild thing for a drug company to be promoting laughter as good medicine. That we take a lot of time to celebrate success. And we measure it. We actually have people, my peers and my reports and my team, they tell me in a survey, how am I doing on joy? At the beginning, I didn't do that well. I was kind of, and so I decided to lighten up. And it's made me a lot happier person, and I think also a better communicator.
Amazing. Ladies and gentlemen, Sally Susman. Old people questions?
So,
Only this one guy right here.
Sa-
Absolutely.
Sally mentioned before I'm ahead of her. So what that means is like give people jobs. You don't get a salary. But she brought up a couple of things that are really, really important for you guys. You get a lot of people that are trying to report the semester's over. That's okay. And that is all those intangibles she talked about. The thank you, the looking people straight in the eye. I mean, it's amazing to me how nobody ever told me that when I was here. And the problem with that stuff today is you poor guys within after life in the Zoom world, and you don't necessarily do that. So you turn the camera off, so you don't have to look, whatever. So really take what she said hard. The other thing too is that it's really, I don't know if that came out, but I think it's just really such an important. One thing that Sally and Tracy both do is there may be, I don't know if there is, there may be somebody working at a policy institute that is smart than Tracy. I don't know if there is, but there may be. And there may be somebody working at a corporation that's a better corporate affairs person than Sally. I doubt it. There may be. But nobody's going to ever outwork them. Nobody will ever outwork either of them. I think it's such an important thing. And I just want to say to the two of you, because I love the chemistry of it, that I graduated here a while ago. I graduated here a while ago. This is the best thing I've ever done. So, thank you both.
Thank you.
Couple of really important things. This is our last campus event of the year. We are so glad to have you here. The book, Breaking Through, Communicating to Open Minds, Move Hearts and Change the World, is at the back. Your signed copy is there. Please don't leave without it.
The book is usually important, so here's what I would suggest. I would suggest you take 2 copies of it and make sure you give it to somebody that really, as you were sitting there, you take mine from the styles of especially. Okay?
Really good point. Thank you.